In CRM, we like to talk about the top of the pyramid and how to treat those customers that are most valuable to us in the best possible way. And we like to talk about this because this thinking is very consistent with the idea that many people have learned, which is every customer should be treated as a king, as every customer should be tried to be as satisfied as possible after he has interacted with our company. However, what is always surprising is that if you think of the analogy of a pyramid, the tip represents a very, very small share of the customer base. And if you think back of section 2, where we had the share of wallet versus size of wallet matrix, you saw that these very, very valuable customers, which in that matrix were on the top right, they account, depending on how you define, anywhere between 1% and 5%. So it's actually relatively little. And surprisingly, it is much, much less than the number of unprofitable customers that many firms have. So this is just an overview of some studies that have been conducted in different settings: B2B, processed metal business; B2C, internet service provider; B2C in banking, and there are many others. So these are just 3 randomly selected examples. But what is interesting is that in those examples, there's always about a third of the customer relationships that turn out to be unprofitable. 31%, 30%, 27%. Let's say anything between a fourth and a third, anything between 25 and 33%. Now, this definition of unprofitability in those analyses does not mean that the CLV is negative. There's usually a shorter duration of the analysis, but it means that there is a sizable share of the customer base who over 1, 2, 3 years, whatever the analysis period was, has a negative contribution margin. So if you spend so much time talking about the top of the pyramid, it seems to make sense that we also start talking about, well, the bottom of the pyramid, or those people who are unprofitable. And the first question that we can ask is why? Why do we have unprofitable customers? Well, and there are 2 different perspectives that you can have on low customer profitability or unprofitability. The first one is a relative view of opportunity cost. Of course, customers are all different in their profit, and every minute you spend with a customer who is of a certain profitability is a minute not spent with a customer who is of more profitability. So relatively speaking, no matter what the profitability is that we have, there will always be more and less profitable customers. And you should probably spend your time disproportionately on the more profitable ones than the less profitable ones. However, this is not the view that I take in the remaining part of this lecture. In the remaining part of this lecture, I take the view of absolute unprofitability. This means that the cost that the customer generates is more than the revenue that the customer generates. And then revenue minus cost becomes negative. Cost that the customer generates can be multitude. There can be sales and direct marketing costs. Some of your customers may require, if you are in a B2B setting, for example, multiple visits of a salesperson in order to make one small purchase. The investment you made in the salespeople visit may simply not be compensated by the revenue or contribution margin that the customer makes. Order processing and order fulfillment cost. Costs for shipping orders to customers. Especially in B2B, a very common problem is that customers who know they have a very high share on your revenue, so who are important to you, refuse to pay for extra services, including rush shipping, even if those extra services are actually associated with extra cost. Cost for accounts receivable. Customers may not pay their bills, for example. In order to identify whether those costs to serve, how they are called, are larger than revenue, we first need to allocate such costs to individual customers. And one way of doing this is called activity-based costing. Well, activity-based costing is something that is very tedious to do in practice, but conceptually, it's actually relatively easy. Assume you have a department that does 3 things. They process customer orders, they handle customers' inquiries, and they perform credit checks. In a given year, they do 51,000 orders, 1,150 inquiries, and 2,700 credit checks. And we know that processing one order takes about 8 minutes, handling a customer inquiry takes 44 minutes, and performing a credit check takes 50 minutes. If you multiply the quantity with the unit time, you get the total time that is spent on each of these tasks. And if you sum this all up, you find out that this department works a total of 593,600 minutes on these different tasks. We know the department has 6 employees who earn on average $100,000 per employee. They work 48 weeks, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, 60 minutes an hour. So per person, 115,200 minutes. You take the total salary cost, you have the total time supplied, you divide one by the other, and you find out that 1 minute costs you 87 cents. You then take the unit time, 844.50, multiply it by 87 cents, and you find out how much each of these activities costs you. Processing one customer order costs you about $7, $6.94. Handling one customer inquiry costs you about $40, $38.19. And performing a credit check, also about $40, $43.40. And now you look at each individual customer. Take Mrs. Smith. There's one credit check that Mrs. Smith has to make at the beginning before she places her first order. She places 3 orders and she does 10 inquiries. Multiplying this all out means she has cost to serve of $446.18. This means if Mrs. Smith in those 3 orders does not make at least $446.18 in revenue, or even in contribution margin, if we take away the cost of goods sold, then Mrs. Smith becomes unprofitable. And you would see that the driver of the unprofitability, if you look at Mrs. Smith, is that she makes so many inquiries because she calls on average 3 times for each order with questions, with change requests, whatever. And it's this large number of customer inquiries that makes her unprofitable. Now, companies operate in 2 different types of settings. So there are 2 different types of cases. There's case 1 of companies where the cost to serve are small and fixed costs are relatively large. Think of a supermarket, for example. In a supermarket, the costs which you have, it's largely the cost of the building, the cost of goods sold. The real cost to serve are limited to you going to the checkout, but this is a very, very small part of your total cost. And in a setting where costs to serve are small and fixed costs are large, customers have very limited potential of becoming unprofitable because the cost to serve just represents such a small percentage. So in those settings, usually every customer contributes, and treating customers differently is not a priority. This is why in a supermarket, treating every customer as a king makes sense because every customer brings profit. Of course, relatively speaking, some may be more profitable than others, but at least every customer brings us some money. So we go for all-out acquisition. Everyone is allowed into our supermarket. And it's enough to measure loyalty because if a customer is profitable every single time he or she buys, the more the customer buys, the more profitable the customer becomes. Case 2 is totally different. Case 2 is a case where fixed costs are low, but costs to serve are very large. Any type of service setting, for example. And if costs to serve are large, customers have a huge potential of becoming unprofitable due to their variation in cost to serve. Some may be profitable, some may be unprofitable. And this means customers need to be managed differently. If we know that a certain group of customers tends to be unprofitable, we may not want to acquire this group of customers. So we need to do what is called selective acquisition. Also, measuring loyalty is no longer sufficient because if a customer is unprofitable, loyalty is actually a bad thing because the longer the customer stays around, the less money we earn or the more loss we make with the customer. Now, you may think that this idea of unprofitable customers and dealing with those unprofitable customers and possibly even getting rid of them, as we will explain in a minute, is something very rare. But there are multiple examples, and you see them here on this slide and also in the article that I put into the additional reading over the past years of companies who actually have decided to terminate unprofitable customers or to deal with them in one specific way. So if we are talking about unprofitable customers, there is an article that I wrote, and you find it in the additional reading called Unprofitable Customers and Their Management, where we define the ABC of unprofitable customer management. First, you should avoid acquiring them. As I mentioned before, if you know a customer group tends to be unprofitable, simply do not acquire this type of customer. Then think about whether customers can possibly be saved. I talk about this on the next slide. But if they cannot be saved, think of the possibility of getting rid of them, and I'll also talk about this later today. Of course, you need to do this in a financially responsible way. So you need to evaluate how much money you gain from getting rid of those customers, and how much cost you may actually incur through negative word of mouth, like the same as we had discussed about social value, but in the opposite direction, because social value is usually about positive word of mouth. Here we're talking about negative word of mouth. There may be legal repercussions that you need to consider, the idea of a class action lawsuit, for example, and there are practical questions of how you actually do it. If any of these points interest you more, I encourage you to go to the reading of and check out this article where I talk much more about these points. But let me, for the moment, and to finish this lecture, just focus on the first two, the B and the C. Be in mind potential rescue operation and catch the possibility of a ban. Sometimes it may not be the customer's fault. It may be your fault that the customer is unprofitable because you have a business model that is unprofitable. If your business model is based on providing services that customers do not value, but they still create cost, then it's not the customer's fault the customer doesn't value whatever you do. It's your fault that you're still doing it. So the solution is not to get rid of your customers, but to stop doing the things that customers do not value, to reduce your cost, or to restructure your business model entirely. Low-cost airlines, when they came up, for example, did exactly that. They took out certain elements of the value proposition of traditional carriers that they believed certain customers do not value. They stripped them out, developed a new product, and made certain customers profitable who probably would not have been profitable at those prices for traditional airlines. However, you also need to see that it's not always your fault. Sometimes the customer becomes unprofitable. Probably these are just people who'd like to call the call center all the time. Probably these are people who spend a tremendous amount of time trying to find the best deal for them and trying to find loopholes. And if this is the case, if it's the customer's fault, you need to think about firing those customers. And there are multiple different strategies that you can use that you can classify according to two dimensions: unilateral, bilateral, indirect, direct. Direct means you explicitly say to the customer that the customer is fired. Indirect is you try to do it in a more subtle way. Unilateral means you only think of your own benefit as a company. Bilateral means you also think of the benefit of the customer. Indirect, unilateral. One example is, for example, withdrawal. Instead of telling the customer that the customer is fired, you simply stop contacting the customer. You don't send any mailings anymore. You don't send any direct marketing, no Salesforce visit, in the hope that probably the customer forgets that you exist and no longer does business with you. Cost escalation. You try to make the relationship with you more costly. Customers have to wait longer in your call center when they call you when they are less profitable. This increases the cost of doing business with you because it takes more time to contact you, which probably incentivizes those customers to leave you and go to one of your competitors. Pseudo de-escalation. You tell them, you can't be my customer anymore, but probably we can find out some other arrangement. Let's stay friends. So instead of ending the relationship, you try to transform the relationship into something else. And there are multiple different other examples. Fait accompli, for example, which is you send an actual letter to the customer and tell the customer that you want to get rid of them. And interestingly, all of these strategies come out of interpersonal relationship disengagement. So these strategies that you see on this slide, in the same way, are used and can be used if, for example, romantic couples break up, if people get divorced, or if friendships end. And if you want to understand better how these strategies look like and possibly think about how they can be used in a B2C setting or in a B2B setting, I encourage you to read the article which you find below and which I equally put into additional readings. And that represents the end of session 3. I hope you enjoyed, and I see you next week for session 4.